Okay, some people are still connecting. All right, let's begin since we're going to be a little bit tight on time. Hello, everyone, good morning, good day, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I think we're covering all the different time zones around the world. Thanks for joining this panel on transitional justice and nature. So this is one of several panels on transitional justice. So for those of you in the audience who are coming from the other panels, we're very grateful that you came to join us. And then likewise, we'll try and join your panels as well. Before I begin, I just want to preface, so this panel was originally organized or co-organized with Liljeblad and Peter and myself. And we're actually co-editors of a thematic issue on transitional justice and nature. I'm just going to share a screen here really quickly, just to issue the call for papers, just so everyone can see it. We certainly welcome any submissions from anyone with a manuscript on transitional justice and nature. And it's going to be a thematic issue in the International Journal of Transitional Justice. We would request that you just send us an email individually to get additional information. I'll put my email in the chat space so everyone can get that. And if you have any questions and guidelines and timelines for this particular thematic issue, please feel free to go ahead and send us a question. We'd be more than happy to answer. So we're going to go ahead and go fairly quickly here. We're going to have 10-minute presentations from each of the speakers, and then that hopefully will provide us with about 30 minutes at the end for question and answer from the audience. So I'm going to be very brief here with the introductions, and I apologize in advance to everyone. So the first presentation, or the first speaker we have, is Killean Botero. She's with Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, and is a postdoc there. So I will turn the Zoom over to Killean. Are you ready?
Hi, yeah, sorry. Good morning, everyone. So in order to keep time, I just just want to be precise. I'm a postdoc working with Liljeblad at the Rivers Project. So we can talk that later, but yeah. So I'm gonna read my presentation. I want to be very clear, and I want to keep time. So the name of this presentation is called Peace Producing Science, Biological Expeditions in the Replacement of War. So after the signature of the peace treaty with FARC, the Colombian government ended a 60-year conflict with one of the oldest guerrilla movements in the world. Alongside the signature of this peace treaty began a national project to conduct biological inventories of species through a series of expeditions that were called Colombia View. The idea behind these expeditions was to explore and register biodiversity in places formerly occupied by the FARC. This talk recounts my experience accompanying 5 of these expeditions as an anthropologist. My interest has been to understand the relationship between science and peace as they are specifically enacted in a post-agreement moment. For this presentation, I will begin by introducing my doctoral project. Then I will talk about a short clip. I won't have time to present, but I'll be sending the link later through the chat if you want to see it. But we're going to talk about that. And lastly, I will conclude by reflecting on the idea of the frontiers of peace and the role biological science played in drawing such lines in Colombia after signing the treaty with FARC. The starting point for my research was to explore the political exercise of building baselines in the midst of a peace process. Recently, there has been a growing interest in understanding the political role of technical instruments such as nature inventories or baselines. In this sense, inventories are a way of making nature legible in order to enable its management and regulation, obscuring the social-natural framework that is part of its construction. In the case of Colombia, the baseline included peace as a concept that will define the approach from which the expeditions and inventories were built. Based on the above, the question guiding this research was how does the scientific and political exercise of making biological inventories produce different forms of peace? This question is addressed taking into account the frontiers of peace that are drawn in this imaginary map of Colombia in peace. How Colombia is imagined with the mobilization of FARC, what is the role of science in the creation of these frontiers, and how the construction of baselines comes to give form and substance to the peace process. This is a particular case in which natural history participates, as it has done before, in the political life of a nation. The Colombia Bio expeditions relate to that history of the terra nullius or res nullius, making reference to the 16th century when the British Crown arrived in Australia and used this concept to justify the conquest of this territory. It refers to no man's lands and no man's things in Roman law. In the context of the post-agreement, it is possible to expand this definition as the terra nullius of peace as places formerly occupied by the FARC that will be now the source of resources for a nation that is thought differently. So the trailer produced by Conciencias, which was the local funding partner in Colombia for the expeditions, it's called This is Colombia, a look from our Colombia Bio expeditions. And it makes a general presentation of all the expeditions in Colombia. A background music like the one generally used to emphasize the heroes in movies accompanies the images of researchers in the field. First, we hear the voice of Andres Acosta saying, it's like entering another country. It was like entering another country almost every time because you encounter an armed group. With this phrase, he opens the clip immediately, enters the voice and the image of another of the researchers from the Sinchi Institute, which is another a scientific research institute in biodiversity in Colombia. Sitting in the middle of the forest, he says, Colombia has been a black hole. Nobody knew what was here. There were very few who managed to go out into the bush for the fear that something would happen to them. The other clips have a similar narrative, that of biodiversity of a forgotten country. Thus, while you see in the background images with researchers touring natural landscapes, walking, riding in boats with flashlights in their heads, Dairon Cárdenas, botanist of the Sinchi Institute, says, it is time for all of this to become known to the world because it was hidden behind a curtain. So let's open that curtain and let's tell our people about our real country. That this country with that this is a country with great biological and cultural diversity. The intensity of the music increases and some drums mark the emotion of the moment. A researcher appears looking through binoculars that focus on a plain of endless landscape, of mountains covered with forests that give the sensation of having found paradise. In the context of Colombia Bio, this exercise of sovereignty over natural resources begins with the recognition, which are the expeditions, and they're used through the development of bioproducts. But it occurs in such way that the sovereignty is thought as having resources at the disposal of a nation. What is done in the name of peace is to recover control and give order to those places that where the state presence operated in different ways. The frontiers in peace find their origin in the concept internal frontiers coined by Margarita Serge, which is a Colombian anthropologist which used this term to describe the 19th century country built on the imaginary of vast jungle regions incapable of governing themselves. Later, this same idea is reproduced to describe zones of armed conflict in Colombia towards the 2000s. It shows how a particular vision of the state is built from the need to control those other territories or no man's land. The internal borders have a colonial history of wild regions to be explored. After signing the treaty with FARC, the idea gained strength to the Colombia Bio project, where the pieces of the puzzle are again distributed and new borders are drawn. But this time, it is the idea of peace which draws the line. Thus, it's an update of this permanent construction of places in which the state seeks to identify what is or not included and how to integrate it into the national economic project. From this perspective, the inventory becomes the present of nature, leaving its previous history in oblivion. It is as if it were possible to erase the past, not only with respect to the enormous changes that nature has undergone in Colombia, but also the great danger of these statements, that of erasing deaths, displacements, mines planted, acts of contamination with pipeline blasting or aerial spraying among others. At a stroke, it seems that we turn the page and start over again in a blank one. In the natural science, this has a name, shifting baseline syndrome, which implies constructing an initial reference to which one can return as if it in itself contained the past. It also means wiping the slate clean with respect to other peace processes that have taken place in Colombia. Such a syndrome becomes the starting point of a new normality. In this way, researchers maintain a constant concern for finding pre-filled these baselines so that they will be the most representative of the place, regardless of whether we were standing on a paddock. The baseline could not be built from the image that human activity and species leave in their wake, but on the contrary, the idea was to be far from it as possible. By capturing nature, it stops in time, leaving behind its past, and writing from the species and from the discovery of species, a genealogy about its role in the origin of peace. What interests me here about nature, it's not its definition as such, but the ways it is giving meaning and used to construct the idea of peace as the absence of conflict and the possibility of discovery. So I'm gonna leave it there, but this is part of my project. Thank you. I think it's right on time, right?
Very well done. Excellent. Thank you for that. We'll proceed to the next presentation. And so this is from Stephen Gasteyer and Ken Lee Pebbles, who are co-authors. So Stephen is associate professor at Michigan State University, and Ken Lee is a PhD candidate at Michigan State University. So I will turn the Zoom over to you. You're muted, Stephen, sorry about that.
There. Okay, so it appears that I can't both share my screen and unmute myself. So now I can. Okay, so, well, thank you very much. This is, you can see the title here. In the interest of time, I won't say any more about that, but I will begin. And also, in the interest of time, while Ken Lee and I were absolutely co-participants in producing this presentation, I will be the only speaker for this part, but Ken Lee will be available to answer questions. Let me start with a land acknowledgement. Michigan State we are coming to you from Michigan State University, which is a land-grant university that occupies the ancestral, tribal, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. The university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. It is important that we recognize this and recognize our obligation that comes from this lineage. All right, so the context of our intervention this morning, we are interested in, well, we've become quite concerned, in fact, by a well-documented increase in the new millennium in land grabs, moving into indigenous areas. So this is specifically a problem in settler colonial states, or at least that's our focus. But what is notable to us is that indigenous populations are fighting back, predominantly using nonviolent resistance and organizations. The resistance has been met not only with legal resources, but also state and non-state violence. And we would add as evidence of that the Global Witness report of last year, which documented the most deaths of environmental activists since they began reporting. Our questions here are, what are those forms of resistance? And how do indigenous groups in the Great Lakes and the Jordan Valley of Palestine, how have they implemented nonviolent resistance to attempted settler colonial resource and land grabs? And we focus specifically in this paper on the use of digital media, especially given the travel restrictions associated with the pandemic, and its limit on actions of solidarity. And we are interested in how those frameworks perform the adherence to indigenous values of respect, relationship, reciprocity, and responsibility, in contrast to settler colonial forces. All right, so we are investigating two cases. The first is the indigenous resistance of the Anishinaabe and Lakota peoples of the Great Lakes region, who have engaged in nonviolent direct action, as well as strategies of legal and administrative action to prevent new mining and pipeline initiatives, such as the oil pipelines of Line 3 and Line 5 by Enbridge, and then the Back 40 mines and Eagle mines that would imperil sacred waters. The nonviolent initiatives have encountered militarized police, state police, and corporate security with implementing charged with implementing these mining and pipeline efforts. We are also looking. Our second case will be looking at Palestinians who across the West Bank, but in particular in the Jordan Valley of the West Bank, have been engaged in nonviolent resistance to Jewish settlers and nonprofits that support the settler movement, and Israeli military efforts to expel Palestinians from the Jordan Valley land, in particular Jordan Valley and the Hebron Hills. Here too, there is increased nonviolent resistance to expulsion orders, meeting violent repercussions by the Israeli Defense Forces, Border Patrol, and settler organizations. Prior to March 2020, we had carried out site visits to both the Jordan Valley and the Menominee and Ojibwe native lands of the Great Lakes. But what we're going to present here is research based on analysis of digital documents by indigenous activists, including websites, Facebook postings, and other social media. The documents reveal similar but distinct narratives of injustice. So the Anishinaabe Coalition appealed to a distinct set of claims that are related to protection of sovereign territory, including culturally important sacred food such as wild rice, protection of water as a living entity, respect for the rights of nature, and assertion of a violation to adherence to the 4 R's: respect, relationship, reciprocity, and responsibility in interactions among human and non-human lives. In the Jordan Valley, Palestinian activists appeal to claims of a tie to the land, care for land, water, plants, and animal systems. This is a claim that's connected specifically. This is a claim that is specifically tied to the Bedouin nonviolence movement, but links to a larger countering of a narrative by the Israeli forces of Palestinians in general that they mismanage the land. They also invoke specifically violations of human rights to habitation, housing, and water. And a major theme is an appeal to address violations of basic rights to life and dignity in the face of violence against people. So in particular, documentation of injuries, deaths of activists, as well as attacks on the land itself, burning of olive trees, uprooting of olive trees, etc. So prior to the restrictions on interaction caused by COVID-19, the ability to create and distribute video of actions was already an important strategy along with visits to and from Solidarity allies. The ability to film and broadcast was particularly important in exerting outside pressure on the state and non-state actors engaged in land grabs. This was facilitated by easy recording through digital iPhone technology for recording and uploading actions. With the restrictions on travel, such communication allowed for a documentation of events, right, and including nonviolent actions, planting trees on the part of Palestinians, water walks on the part of the Anishinaabe activists, and of violence perpetrated by state or non-state actors protected by the state, such as Israeli settlers and corporate security apparati. Once taken, the digital videos become documents that were distributed through Indigenous and ally networks to maintain momentum for action and to tell a story to a broader audience that could in turn exert pressure through the national and international media and political establishment. So what we will show next are two efforts to map the movement of those digital media documents to reach those intended and then ultimately broader audiences. So first, in the Great Lakes case, digital media documents circulate, maintaining a coalition among the associated tribes and organizations within the Great Lakes region. The digital documents simultaneously are dispersed through channels that reach ally solidarity groups that include environmental organizations. From there, the documents are circulated through local media and then to national media and ultimately international, including, for instance, the CBC Indigenous section. This is the Canadian Broadcasting section, which has established CBC Indigenous, which is an indication of growing interest in native issues, in Indigenous issues in North America, which include these resistances to pipelines and mining. In the context of the Jordan Valley, the digital documents record actions, including efforts to maintain a connection to and care for the land, even in the face of violent action to facilitate expulsion. The digital recordings with messaging in English, Arabic, and occasionally Hebrew are distributed among Palestinian solidarity organizations, but also international, including a small number of Israeli organizations who in turn share the messaging through local progressive media and in some cases through more mainstream media. And an example of this is the reporting of the killing of a prominent Palestinian activist, Haj Suleiman, on the cable network MSNBC in late January of this year. So our paper demonstrates the role of digital media in contesting settler colonial land grabs by indigenous activists in the Jordan Valley, Palestine, and in native nations of the North American Great Lakes. It bears noting that while we have highlighted similarities in these cases, there are differences in the settler colonial context. While the Great Lakes is largely at this point about corporate takings of land, Israel is at an earlier stage of attempting to settle citizens and attempting to expel the indigenous population. Still, we see some insights for the broader context. Even as settler colonial forces have increased in the aggressiveness of land and resource takings, indigenous resistance has employed nonviolent strategies of obstruction and creation, maintaining the presence and asserting rights and sovereignty. Key to this are digital nonviolent strategies that bring internal and external solidarity and pressure against the offending state and non-state actors. This includes claims to violations of the principles of the 4 Rs and rights frameworks, and including rights to nature, all of which are facilitated through reaching broader media outlets through solidarity networks. So we can close with that.
Right. Thanks, Stephen. All right, great presentation. And let's proceed now to the next speaker. So Liljeblad, so the next speaker is Liljeblad Vian. She's professor at Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, or de Madrid. Liljeblad, are you ready?
Yeah, I just...
Okay, I'll hand things over to you.
For my slides, just a second.
Okay.
I'm always struggling with the sharing part. Okay, that works. Okay. Oh, something happened with one of my other slides. Oops. Let's see. Sorry. Anyway, yeah. Okay, I will do it with this. I lost the slide. I'm sorry.
No.
So hi, everyone. My name is Liljeblad Vian. I'm also the principal investigator of the starting grant ERC Rivers, Human Water Rights Beyond the Human. And what I would like to share to you today is some reflections, more meta reflections that I've been working with since a couple of years with Judge Belkis Izquierdo. She is an indigenous Arahuaco judge in Colombia in the Chamber of Truth and Recovery of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. So I will be talking and presenting today, as there is a time problem and also language issues. But I just want to share, and that was the slide that I wanted to share with you, but I lost that one that we have been discussing, and these issues already in a couple of more open seminars, but mainly in Spanish. But I can send you then the links to our seminars and speech circles I have been organizing together with her since a few years now. And our collaboration comes already from before that I was a PI of this research project and before she was a judge in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And our reflections comes actually from the ruling of 2019 from her chamber, from her team that recognizes an indigenous territory, the Katsatsu of the indigenous Awa people, as victim of the armed conflict. And that was a ruling that she issued in November 2019, and that obviously has raised quite a lot of questions and debate, not only in Colombia, but also beyond Colombia in the transitional justice field, but also in the field of environmental law. And our meta reflections were on why has it been taken so long that that this non-human identity and indigenous concept can be recognized as a victim. Certainly in all the debates about damages to the environment, nature, ecosystems by armed conflict. But where is the position of indigenous territory with its multiple life systems? And okay, no, it's here. It's not on my, well, so those are the previous seminars, and we also have co-written a few years ago a short reflection about how to decolonize transitional justice from indigenous territories. That was a few years before the ruling, but there we have already a bit of seed reflections why it's so important to also consider the indigenous concept of territory as a victim of an armed conflict. And that has all those reflections also come from our own previous anthropological work in Guatemala. So that's my main country and my main field of work with indigenous survivors of the genocide of the 70s, 80s. And it was during my PhD research a long time ago. And there, in 2007, already learned how the impact of the armed conflict not only violated the individual and human rights, but from their perspective, from the Maya Kekchi perspective, all the bombing, all the destruction by the army also defiled and violated also the sacred hills and the sacred river, where many corpses were thrown during the massacres, etc. Back then, however, when I was presenting all this kind of research among my transitional justice scholars and human rights community, there was not that much openness to that kind of other visions of questioning the human beyond the human. While these days, it's really a very hotly debated issue. And through the special issue with my colleagues Jonathan and Peter, we are actually also trying to also put these more deeper questions on the table. So thinking about our reflections with Belkis and the logic about indigenous collective thinking, what we see as some of the several obstacles is actually what an indigenous scholar of New Zealand, Linda Tui-Smith, already mentioned in her groundbreaking book of Decolonizing Social Science of '99, is how indigenous visions and practices about land and has been marginalized, excluded, as also a source of knowledge. And thinking about the reflections of another indigenous scholar of Canada, we could see that this kind of ruling actually is also a concrete site of political and legal exchange to think about the de-anthropocentralization of the indigenous state discourses. So what we saw as one of the meta-reflections is that the colonial judicial model is still present also in the legal sphere. Thinking about the positionality of the superiority of Western knowledge. And for example, indeed, there has been a huge advance in recognizing in the international sphere in collective and indigenous people rights. But looking at the work of Pedro Garzón, an indigenous scholar of Mexico, about legal pluralism, and how at the end, despite this recognition of indigenous people rights, in the practice, many judges, many courts still reduces indigenous visions and practices just as uses as customs, customary law, infra-legal phenomena, and still marginalizing indigenous knowledge. So one of the other reflections that we have, and we don't have clear-cut answers, is what is a connection with recognizing indigenous territory as a victim of an armed conflict with the legal hype of rights of nature, rights of rivers. We see there a lot of tension between indigenous conceptualizations of what is territory and what belongs to a territory. But time-wise, we don't have enough time to go in deeper to that. And one of the other meta-reflections that we had was how can, since the territory now is recognized as living being, as a victim of the armed conflict, to what extent it can actually talk? And the next phases of the whole judicial procedure in Colombia. And there we were also thinking about one of those emblematic texts of the Indian philosopher Spivak. To what extent can the attorney speak? The territory and the damages is speaking, but to what extent other lawyers, other judges can actually, is there enough political space to actually hear what the territory is saying during this kind of judicial processes? And then to finalize this brief talk, is that we were also thinking to what extent is it possible to actually talk about a transformative pluriverse horizon for transitional justice, taking this kind of groundbreaking legal decisions as a contribution to the literature debate about transformative transitional justice, looking to the root causes, etc. Can this kind of legal decisions actually also transform transitional justice, recognizing more interlegal dialogues and more pluriverse of legal conceptions of what is a victim? And this is a bit my reflections that I wanted to share with you that we have been working on. Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. Thanks, Liljeblad. And well done on time. Quite impressive. Thanks for that. So we'll proceed directly to the next speaker. So Rachel Killean, senior lecturer at Queen's University of Belfast. Rachel, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll turn over the Zoom to you.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here to talk to you about environmental restorative justice and its prospects in a transitional justice setting. So in the time that I have, I'm just going to briefly introduce what I mean by environmental restorative justice and discuss briefly the extent to which transitional justice has traditionally incorporated restorative justice approaches. And then I'll turn to my two main arguments, which are that adopting environmental restorative justice might challenge some of the transitional justice fields, anthropocentric and neo-colonial tendencies, which we just heard a little bit about already. So when I refer to environmental restorative justice, what I mean is a body of scholarship, of, sorry, I'm managing two screens and you've all just moved around for some reason that I can't understand. I'll put you over here. There we go. So how can we better think about the range of harms that are perpetrated against ecosystems and non-human beings, particularly those that are frequently overlooked or minimized by criminal justice frameworks? So this is one of the questions of environmental restorative justice. The second is how we could use existing principles of restorative justice, such as voluntary participation of victims and perpetrators, accountability for harm, repair, and the pursuit of relational justice to respond to environmental harms. And then third, the flip side of that question is how can we infuse those existing restorative justice principles with greater appreciation of environmental harm and the needs of the natural world? So while answers to those questions obviously vary across contexts, Miranda Forsyth and her colleagues have helpfully distilled 5 key principles that generally underpin environmental restorative justice. So these include an orientation towards healing relationships after violence, including violence against nature, the participation of those who have perpetrated harm and experienced harm, including other than human beings, the use of storytelling and dialogue as a way of understanding and addressing harm, and that includes harm experienced by other than humans, an understanding of what has occurred through the identification of that harm, the victims, and responsibility, And finally, accountability, but with a focus on a return to relational justice as opposed to more retributive justice that we might associate with criminal punishment. So there is relatively little scholarship, there you go, that looks specifically at environmental restorative justice in transitional contexts, but more traditional anthropocentric understandings of restorative justice have formed part of the practices and mechanisms that we've used in the context of transitions. So the most high profile case is probably South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but we can think of other examples in Rwanda, for example, in the Gacaca courts, and some of the responses here to paramilitary violence in Northern Ireland, where I'm currently based. And then more recently, Colombia has emerged as potentially one of the first transitional justice contexts to move towards environmental restorative justice. So there, the general regulations that govern the special jurisdiction of peace talks about harmonization between victims and perpetrators, but also harmonization of territory, as we've just been reflecting on. So it's quite a pertinent moment to reflect on what it is that environmental restorative justice might offer the field of transitional justice. So my first argument here is that environmental restorative justice challenges the anthropocentrism in the field of transitional justice. So there's exceptions, for example, in Colombia and in Peru, but normally transitional justice focuses on human suffering and does not really recognize other than human suffering as worthy of either recognition or redress. And in part, that's a result of its grounding in human rights law, in criminal law, and in international humanitarian law. And when you look at nature through this framework, it becomes either the property of a human being or a human organization, or it's a disputed resource. So it's not an entity that suffered harm as such. And what environmental restorative justice offers is a potential framework for looking beyond harms that are considered criminal and expanding that understanding of victimhood. So there's an Australian judge, Judge Preston, who's been quite influential in environmental restorative justice, and he classified environmental victimhood as being individuals, communities, classes of people, but also the biosphere and non-human biota. So if we thought about how we could apply that in the aftermath of armed conflict or repression, so if you think about, for example, the poisoning of a water source, what you would see is that there are human beings who relied upon that water source who have been harmed, but the water source itself has also been harmed, and the flora and fauna that rely on the water source have also been harmed. So it brings into picture a more holistic understanding of suffering. And that raises the challenge, as was just reflected on at the end of Liljeblad's presentation, of who then speaks for those harmed entities. But for environmental restorative justice advocates like Judge Preston, who I just mentioned, the fact that a natural entity cannot speak in the way that we are capable of hearing as human beings is not an insurmountable problem, as long as we can think meaningfully about the role of surrogates, and that the surrogate that is selected can bring an ecocentric, not an anthropocentric perspective to proceedings. So there's some precedent for this. So natural objects such as rivers and trees have already been represented in restorative justice conferences in Australia and in New Zealand. But there's challenges, of course, in identifying who the appropriate surrogate is in those examples. So, if you don't have someone with a strong spiritual connection or cultural connection, you might think about a scientist or someone that can quantify the harm in that kind of way. But that moves the conversation towards a more facts and figures type of framing. And that might run counter to restorative justice principles, which are really about building relationships. So in that context, I think it's not surprising that this conversation has evolved out of settler colonial states and has often been discussed in the context of harms perpetrated against Indigenous communities. So that brings me to my second argument, which is that environmental restorative justice offers a framework for challenging the neocolonialism that tends to continue to dominate transitional justice. And this reflects transitional justice's failure to reflect meaningfully the harm experienced by Indigenous peoples, but also Indigenous peoples' understandings of justice and repair. So Indigenous people are often the victims of conflict. So either they face direct attacks on their individual and collective rights, or they face forced recruitment into armed groups, or they just experience the militarization and encroachment of their territory as a result of a conflict that does not directly concern them. But those kinds of harms are not often acknowledged in transitional justice processes. So a lot of my work is in Cambodia, and where that research has what that research has shown, is that the Indigenous experiences there under the Khmer Rouge never really formed a meaningful part of the attempts to deal with the past, and that has precluded them from reparations and the acknowledgement that they too suffered under this regime. Nor has the end of that regime brought an end to the challenges or violence they face. If anything, that's only increased actually. So environmental restorative justice offers one possible tool for challenging this marginalization. So it's not synonymous, and we have to be careful about that, but environmental restorative justice has been influenced by these relational understandings of justice that have been developed in Indigenous traditions of conflict resolution. So you can see that it moves beyond the kind of strict legal formats that we're so fond of in the global north, and also allows for a greater openness in the range of means of expression, which can be quite important. And building on it, my first argument, that actual ability to perceive of harm to other than human beings can create a more fertile ground for taking Indigenous worldviews seriously in a transitional justice process, and recognizing that for some people that have been around a very long time, the idea of other than human victimhood is not new. It's a traditional understanding of a kinship structure, as is the understanding of other than human agency. So if we attend to those diverse cultural frameworks and traditions, environmental restorative justice can form a space where there's more ways to think about diverse ways of seeing the world, rather than staying super grounded in our legalistic kind of global north understandings. There's risks here, obviously, that we have to be mindful of, particularly as a global north woman speaking about this. You know, as Killean and others have argued, environmental restorative justice opens a pathway to cultural inclusivity, but also leads to a pathway to the trivialization or co-option of Indigenous culture in the pursuit of a more universalist claim. So this has already been called out, not in the context of transitional justice, but in settler states such as Australia and Canada, where they have been using restorative justice without the environmental element. And Indigenous scholars have called out that this is becoming marketized in a way that is about regulating an Indigenous population, not actually meaningfully addressing a justice need. So I think in this regard, if we're thinking about transitions and transitional justice, we can bring into dialogue environmental restorative justice and transitional justice from below, and that body of work that's always about pushing back against top-down measures that fail to actually meaningfully listen to what communities are saying. So some very brief concluding thoughts. So I wanted to highlight the possibilities here. It's not about trying to advocate for a specific measure, because that will always be context dependent in the aftermath of a conflict. But I think that this framework offers a way of thinking more holistically and widening our understanding of who a victim is, what representation means, and what justice means. This is obviously something fraught with practical challenges. There's also the risk of a new hierarchy and conflict between victim groups. There's another easy trap that assumes that an Indigenous population will always align their worldview with the interests of a natural entity. And that's, you know, an oversimplification that overlooks a whole range of complexities and relations. So we would not want to fall into those traps either. But I think restorative justice also teaches us that conflict is not inherently bad. It's not something that we need to resist. It's rather something that can create a space for greater participatory decision-making, increasing empathy, and actually developing our understanding of what justice means. And that could be particularly useful in a transitional context. So I guess in conclusion, restorative justice offers us a space to think about the past, engage with tensions, and maybe move towards a future that better recognizes different communities and different relationships to the natural world. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that fascinating presentation. And we are turning now to Peter Doran, who's also senior lecturer at Queen's University of Belfast. Peter, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I'll
Okay.
just see if I can get my slides. Can everybody see that?
Yep, looks good.
Great. Now, these slides are really impressions. I'm speaking really from the context of Northern Ireland and Ireland's post-conflict experience, and I'm particularly interested in the northwest cross-border region of Derry in Northern Ireland and Donegal just across the border in the Republic of Ireland, where a number of motions have gone before local councils calling for a recognition of the rights of nature. And these motions have emerged from a gathering of environmental activists based in and around the northwest cross-border area. And most of them are engaged in opposition to extractivist activity, proposals for gold mining and other explorations. So they're responding to a failure, a systemic failure, as they would put it, to address environmental and planning and conservation in the context of our suppose transitional justice narrative and as part of the peace process. And my reflections here are just a very early attempt, and I want to acknowledge the contribution of Declan, who's participating today in this conversation. It's an early attempt to reflect on the context, the cultural, colonial, and political context for the what might be regarded as the surprising emergence of these political motions and the turn towards the rights of nature as a response by these communities who have experienced systemic failure and marginalization from the political elites in terms of their interest in opposing new extractivist activities. So these developments in local councils in the northwest of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland are most significant because they've emerged in the face of a generation of systemic and regulatory failure in the field of environmental protection. The environment and nature are fields of silence in the narratives of transitional justice. The post-conflict narrative in Northern Ireland is littered with systemic failures and even scandals, one of which contributed to the collapse of our political institutions and their subsequent suspension for 2 years. Now, the context is interesting. Ireland occupies a peculiar place in the European imaginary as the only Western European country that has had both an early and a late colonial experience. Culturally, politically, and ecologically, Ireland straddles histories of colonialism and modernity. In other words, it's a place in between. James Joyce argued that the Irish imagination was at its best when moving between two twinsome minds, that is, when it had two thinks at a time. The philosopher Richard Carney explains that the Irish have always been most creative when following a logic of both and, acknowledging a mix of double fidelities, whether they're religious, national, psychological, and cultural. So these doublings call for new mediations. Seamus Heaney, who grew up beside the border in Northern Ireland, put it well in his poem Terminus, saying, "Two buckets were easier carried than one. I grew up in between." For Heaney, this positionality, this in-between status, summons what he called a symbolic reordering of the island, open to new possibilities of Irishness, Britishness, Europeanness, and planetariness, creatureliness. And for Carney, it was precisely this philosophy, this ethos or calling of twinsome minds that seek to turn polar opposites into fertile openings, a way of thinking that deeply informed the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998, the platform for the Anglo-Irish peace process that continues to unfold. Now, a note on language, memory, and coloniality. The promissory note of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement contained a great silence. That is the land or ecology of Ireland itself, that is the island itself in its being. The production of silences, forgetting, and even ignorance are the marks of colonialism embedded in language. Disrupting these silences and acts of forgetting installed at the heart of language was the self-conscious project of the Field Day Company, led by figures such as Seamus Heaney, Seamus Dean, Brian Friel, and Stephen Ray. Field Day was a disruptive project of theatre, writing, and dialogue based in Derry in the 1980s and 90s. Perhaps an example of border thinking. Border thinking comes from the decolonial theory and is a concept first used by Gloria Anzaldúa to point to the early life of theory and episteme that must have a lived dimension, an existence that sits at the borders of a colonial matrix of power. In this early life, theories and epistemologies must have a lived dimension to them, lived in the sense of the experiences of those who have been excluded from the production of knowledge by modernity. Field Day worked hard to remind us that the colonial imperative is to destroy all memory of what went before, for the new colonial order is always founded on amnesia. Now, Michael Cronin at Trinity picks up where Field Day left off in his wonderful Irish and Ecology. It's a book called Irish and Ecology. Cronin reconnects questions of colonialism, forced amnesia, and political ecology. He notes that language situates people in their environment in terms of both description and narration, telling you where you are and what's around you and where you come from. So the project of removing, for example, the Irish language from public life as part of the colonial intervention, as one long-term consequence has been the alienation of people from their own surroundings. Cronin cites Brian Friel's play, Translations, which explores the experience of displacement and exile when agents of colonialism impose English translations of Irish place names. He observes that the population shifts to a language, in this case it was a shift to English, which bears no relationship to the environment in which they find themselves. The ecological consequences are profound in that the connection to place and history, a sense of which is central to the creation of a sustainable and resilient locality, is seriously fractured. So Cronin captures the dilemma for the post-colonial island of the in-between in an observation by Palmer, Baker, and Nayley. We may imagine ourselves at an angle to the Anglosphere in Ireland, basking in our guilt-free positioning as both recovering colony and third richest country in Europe, but we have little countervailing sense of what exactly the absence that haunts our modernity might be. Now, another writer that I have used is Sinead Mercier, who uses the Irish ferry fort, the island's most common archaeological feature, to explore the island as a site of Enlightenment-inspired lawscapes, The fairy forts are circular mounds of earth dating back to 600 to 900 AD, or are the sites of tombs and caverns dating back to the Neolithic era. Undertaking a special reading of the law in Ireland and fairy forts, Mercier offers an analysis of the accelerated destruction of these features, showing that the law is an apparatus of enlightenment rationality. Now, I want to move on, but Mercier's work is interesting because it makes a direct connection with the memory, the living memory of an alternative epistemology and ontology, insofar as people continue to believe in this animist being referred to as the fairy around the fairy fort. They are said to inhabit certain parts of the rural landscape, particularly these forts, but also trees and wells. Now, just to go to the close of the paper, the emergence of a rights of nature coalition with origins in the borderlands of Derry and Donegal in the northwest of Ireland. By the way, the location of Brian Friel's fictional accounts should come as no surprise. Working on the margins of their respective jurisdictions, these activists in Derry and Donegal have been acquainted with multiple forms of exclusion, including what Owen O'Quinnigan has recently described as a form of epistemic violence or exclusion. Derry, for example, was the seat of early civil rights demonstrations in the late 1960s and 70s, and was deeply influenced by events unfolding in Europe and the protest movements in North America. Arguably, it is from this point of exteriority that border thinking opens up to radicalized theory and epistemology, reaching out today to new global allies, including a recent solidarity visit from representatives of the Zapatista movement. From a position of exteriority, activist communities prompted by a neo-extractivist gold rush on both sides of the border have confronted a systemic failure of environmental governance in post-conflict Northern Ireland and in the cross-border territories by reoccupying that generative place of in-between. They are arguably critically inflecting contradictory histories of colonialism and European modernity, reaching potentially for what Arturo Escobar describes as a pluriversal transition, an ontological politics from the perspective of radical interdependence. And my closing point, and maybe the main point of this paper, is that the primary point of learning about the nature of the peace process and the transition and the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the institutions that have reproduced the lawscape of capital and neoliberalism is that the process has an ontological dimension that has gone unchallenged. For Escobar, for example, with relational worlds, the defense of territory, life, and the commons is one and the same. The adoption of a rights of nature campaign is also a democratic moment and a commitment to the view that what is done onto communities is done onto nature reimagined. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks for that, Peter. So I'll be the last speaker, and I'll try to follow the model of all of the other speakers and keep my comments very brief. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so I'll acknowledge country as well. So I'm currently at Australian National University in Canberra, and we are located here on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. And so we pay our respects to the elders past, present, and the continuing issues of sovereignty. As a matter of positionality, I'll also note that I myself, I'm a member of Indigenous peoples from Myanmar. So that's in the lower right-hand corner there. You see me in my traditional dress. I'm a member of what's called the Pa'o peoples of Myanmar. So we're a rather small population located predominantly in Shan State, which is in the northeastern mountains and near the Golden Triangle. We're in the Golden Triangle infamous Golden Triangle of Myanmar. So my presentation today is basically about the question of indigenous community conservation areas, ICCAs in Myanmar, and the idea of ICCAs as part of a post-conflict transition process. And so I'm looking forward into the future about what may arise in Myanmar after there's some outcome from the current civil unrest and what is ostensibly now becoming a civil war. So I make my comments with some regret as to about the current circumstances in the country. Just a brief background regarding Myanmar. I just want everyone to understand that it's a rather complex landscape, both in terms of environment, in terms of people. It's under the British era, under the colonial period. It was never entirely pacified. So there were a large number of various different peoples with various claims of sovereignty, self-determination, autonomy. They were recognized cultural identities. Following colonialism, they were categorized by the military government, which under the first military coup under 1962, into 135 what are called ethnic nationalities. But this is disputed because if you ask people who self-identify, the number of groups are dramatically higher, and it varies based on which anthropologist you talk to. One of the things, though, is that in Myanmar, areas of high natural resource density, this includes biodiversity, gemstones, forests, minerals, these all tend to lie within the indigenous areas or the minority peoples areas. And as a result of this, because the natural resources wealth is a contested item, this means that a large number of the conflict zones are located in indigenous lands. So it's a convergence of natural resource wealth, biodiversity, ethnic or indigenous claims to self-determination, and conflict all converging at the same place. And unfortunately, it's in a place where the state itself is known for consistent violations of human rights. All right. So with the ICCAs, that they're being introduced, or they were being introduced prior to the military coup as an attempt to try and resolve some of these issues. A lot of my research, as coming from Myanmar, is I'm very much interested in these bottom-up perspectives. I'm very much focused on the issues of agency, indigenous agency. And ICCAs are an attempt at indigenous agency to fashion their own solution. And it's a way of trying to deal with the conservation failures of the Myanmar state. The state has been captured by the military and various business elites. And the instruments of the state, including the Ministry of Environmental Conservation, have used natural resources as a means of wealth accumulation. And so ICCAs are an attempt at exercising self-determination to take control back over the environment. And in that process, also support the process of democratization, particularly federal democracy. So before the coup, the idea was that ICCAs were a way of encouraging subsidiarity. So the principle of subsidiarity is about decentralization, local control, local management, and this would encourage greater indigenous self-determination, but also encourage a transition to civilian authority. The other component of this is that with ICCAs, because so many of the indigenous communities were following subsistence lifestyles, that this would enable more sustainable development patterns. Whereas the state-driven models, because it was falling under military control with wealth accumulation processes, they were non-sustainable environmental practices. So my response for this entire presentation is coming out of a presentation by the All Burma Indigenous Peoples Alliance. It was a conference for the UNFCCC, Conference of the Parties. And it was trying to think critically about this notion of ICCAs and having a little bit of a reflection about, what does it take to make this effective? Prior to the coup, things were not ideal. There was a reason why indigenous peoples in Myanmar sought ICCAs. They were dealing with an issue of trying to get away from centralized state authority. They were struggling with this issue of land grabbing or dispossession. What was not helping was that many INGOs that shall remain nameless were promoting global patterns of conservation that was in collaboration with the state and inadvertently supporting an authoritarian legacy in that process. And it's I guess you use the term greenwashing, where international environmental treaties are being used as an excuse for dispossession of indigenous lands and a suppression of traditional livelihoods. Post-coup, the situation, as most of you probably know, has gotten much worse. There has been a complete suspension of all peace talks. There's been a return or intensification of the historical civil wars that have always plagued the country since its independence. And there was an end to a lot of initiatives at co-management and decentralization. And so, and because the military is desperate for cash to sustain its weapons acquisitions, there's been an acceleration of natural resource extraction, an acceleration of dispossession. So my thoughts on this, and I guess my motivation for this discussion was that a lot of what the a lot of the motivations for ICCAs in Myanmar was very consistent with Elinor Ostrom. So Elinor Ostrom had issued her famous work on governing the commons, supporting the idea of self-governing collectives. To me, this is very similar to this notion of indigenous communities engaging in environmental conservation. And also that, she was very supportive of this idea that local control was more sustainable. And so once again, it was compatible with these indigenous claims of sustainable patterns of management. My only concern, though, and this is where I get to the critical component, was that Ostrom also issued a number of conditions. And in her mind, the idea of having local control over the environment, a local control over commons, was dependent upon 8 conditions. And she was very, very specific about these. And in a place like Myanmar, I'm actually very concerned about the extent to which these conditions actually can be met. So, the first condition was that commons are supposed to have clear boundaries, but in a place like Myanmar, those boundaries are not clear. Some of these boundaries are contested, either between the state and the various indigenous peoples, or even there's a situation where indigenous peoples claim lands that overlap. The other thing too is that governance, so Ostrom said that governance had to be context specific, but in Myanmar, you have indigenous peoples who coexist on the same land. And they're pluralist spaces, not just in terms of culture, but also in terms of governance models. And then on top of that, there are these ongoing efforts to overlay international standards of conservation, which are not always entirely compatible with customary forms of governance. There's also this question about participatory decision-making, and that the legacy of state rule within Myanmar was always about authoritarian rule, and it was always about the state control over environmental conservation being done in alliance with international aid organizations in some form or fashion. And so the question is, well, just how much participation can really occur with ICCAs? Is it really effective participatory decision-making if they're not being recognized by the state and if they're not being recognized by the international community? The other problem here is that commons, Ostrom says that there must be some reliable data, there must be monitoring. In a place like Myanmar, there's serious capacity issues, and whatever technology exists for surveillance is being actually held by the authoritarian regime, namely the military, who've been the beneficiaries of surveillance technology from certain countries that shall remain nameless tonight. The other thing too is, Ostrom said there has to be some understanding of sanctions, but in a place like Myanmar, it's unclear as to what justice can mean if you're in a pluralist space, if you have different governance systems, different ethics, different values. Conflict resolution has to be accessible. Once again, I'm a little bit concerned here because Myanmar is not a place with rule of law. There's extreme distrust of justice mechanisms. There's extreme distrust of any kind of system that has ever worked through state justice. There's always been traditional forms of justice, but that invariably involves some level of negotiation between different indigenous peoples. The other conditions, there has to be a recognition of right to organize. I'm a little bit concerned here because there is no right to organize in Myanmar right now. And there's also the last condition that Ostrom talks about is that that commons requires larger networks. And here, I'm not quite certain that that's feasible given the level of distrust, not just with the state, but between different indigenous peoples with each other, because there are historical issues there as well. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop there. And these are just some pictures I have of some indigenous peoples that surround the lands where I come from. And this is one of the sacred sites that I'm just showing you here that the Pa'o people and the Shan share near Inle Lake. So thanks everyone for your attention. And I think now we'll open everything up for Q&A. I actually have a set of questions here that have already been submitted from the chat space. I'm just going to relay that while the audience submits their questions. So for the audience, if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. But for the questions that were typed in already, for Carolina, there's a question from Uli Beck about how can you explain peace as being the new frontier? So let me just give you that question first. Let me give questions to everyone else so we can just go very quickly, and then I'll come back and get everyone's answers. And also you'll have time to think of an answer. For Liljeblad, there's a question from Ida Meyenberg. Sorry if I mispronounced that name. And the question is, what are your thoughts about humans providing legal representation for the environment? So in other words, can an indigenous person act as a legal representative for an ecological feature of some kind? Munini Matuku has a question, I think, for everyone. But I'll probably direct this to Stephen and Ken Lee, and then also probably Rachel, because I think your presentations probably dealt with this. How does the judicial system reconcile the collective nature of indigenous perspectives? Because so many justice systems, particularly human rights, are based on individual rights, individuals holding rights. But yet we're having fundamental discussions about indigenous groups exercising claims. So let's get the answers first, and then I'll swing back around and get the questions from Lauren and Erica. I think that I saw your hands up. Okay, so Carolina, you want to go first?
Sure. Okay, thank you very much, and very great presentations. About Ulik's Beck's question, sorry, about how is peace a new frontier? It has to do also with Colombia's geography. So during conflict happens as if it was outside Bogota, and the mountains is what guides the principal population, where everybody's standing, and what is outside that if it was off borders. So those places are the places where a conflict usually has taken place, like the Amazonia or the Pacific region, something outside our Andean geography. So when Margarita Serge talked about the internal frontiers, she was making reference to those frontiers that are outside, like our capital cities, which are most on the Andes, and everything that was outside these borders, she called it the internal frontiers. So for peace, what happened is that it was argued that these places that supposedly were not reachable for the state now open for science. So if it was as if you could now go to these places that are far away from Bogota, and you can explore scientifically. And this is a project based on taxonomy. So the idea is to grab everything you see. So you take all species and you put it into the to the proper registry of Colombians' biodiversity. So what peace did is like draw new frontiers where this scientific project could reach. And then it created this imaginary of a diverse biodiversity that was hidden somewhere in the middle of Colombia, not taking into account that these places specifically are the places where we have coca productions, where we have illegal and legal gold mining, where we have aerial spraying for coca, where we have all kind of problems. But this idea of biodiversity opening up for science was just simply denying that other logics of the country, that they were happening, but they were erased with the idea of undiscovered biodiversity. And I hope that was clear.
Thanks for that. Liljeblad?
Yeah, thank you for the interesting questions and also for the other presentations. The question about representation, that's always a very complex question anyway, certainly when it comes to indigenous peoples. And when we enter the realm about non-humans and who speaks from the non-human, and can indigenous representatives speak for rivers, etc., that's one of the ongoing discussions right now when it comes to the whole movement of granting rights to rivers and mountains and who speaks from them in court. In many legal cases, what happens is that they assign like a guardian system, which comes actually from, or which is inspired by the New Zealand model. When New Zealand issued a law to protect one of the main rivers, they designed that guardian system, and that guardian system is now hopping around the world, just as all the other ideas of granting rights to rivers. But when it comes to indigenous representation, I think that one of the things that could be or that should be taken as a starting point is a right to self-determination, and that when a river or mountain in certain indigenous territory has been recognized as a victim, then it should be those indigenous peoples themselves that internally discuss and see who could speak or who should speak. Is it a lawyer? Is it a healer? Is it a shaman? Is it an elder? Is it a mixture? Women, men, younger? I think that would be one of the starting points when it comes to about the question on who represents from an indigenous point of view elements of nature in court. And I think that's more or less my reflection on that. Instead that court imposes the system, I would say that's a point that I would like to cross.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. So then regarding the question about the indigenous collective rights and the individual rights approach by courts, Stephen, Kenley, and Rachel, I mean, maybe you can just real quick, I want to get answer Lauren's question here. So let's, if you could just make brief answers, please.
Yeah, and I'll let Kenlia take this for us.
Okay. Oh, your microphone, just unmute, Kenley.
Sorry, I thought I had hit that. All right, so basically what you're talking about is like Western law construct, right? That is directly placed, you know, you have the aspects of treaty law. So treaty law is really important when we're talking about this, because treaty law has been essential in these discussions, because these are Native American nations, even though we often use the concept of words of tribe and we don't think about it that way, but these are negotiations between nations, and these treaties were established. And that's what a lot of these discussions are going up against. So the rights of nature that the Menominee Nation right now will be going up, eventually up to the Supreme Court, I'm quite sure. Waiting for that to happen, probably might happen later this year, but maybe next year, that will be occurring, that will go before the Supreme Court. So one of the things that they're pulling from is the treaty law, and it's really, really crucial when you're looking at the Menominee case. Now, this also then reflects, because we're talking about national treaties and agreements that are established within this law, not individual, that this is something to think about when we talk about rhetorical sovereignty. So rhetorical sovereignty is something that Indigenous peoples, we often talk about the importance that we have this voice, and we have the ability to speak in ways that other people cannot speak for us, because we have a different identity. And this is really, really important. And it is not just like an individual identity. This is a collective identity. And this is something that we, really push on. So when we talk about rhetorical sovereignty, you're talking about a collective voice of Indigenous peoples. And when we're talking about that, you have to understand too that it's very closely related to theory of access. And we're talking about theory of access in the sense of, one of the things that's missing in theory of access is actually the very first step is recognition. So recognition then moves into the theory of access. And I'm going to let Stephen take over this part.
Yeah, I think that's that says enough just in the interest of time for right now. So Rachel, did you want to contribute to this question, answering this question as well?
And just very briefly, just to offer a different angle, I suppose, because the question seems to be also, how can we think about collective rights in a judicial structure? And I think when we're thinking about transitional justice, it's worth acknowledging that's not new. There's already tools for managing collectives. Again, in Cambodia, where a lot of my research is based, the notion of collective victimhood and collective repair is something that has already been explored. It's pragmatically challenging, all of the challenges about who speaks and who doesn't speak and whose voices are heard. But these are not new challenges. So if we think of the territory as a victim, or in future other territories as victims, there's collective ways to acknowledge victimhood and to think meaningfully about repair. It requires us to think differently about what an actual court setting involves and who has to actually be in the courtroom compared to who can also still benefit from a transitional justice process. So there's room for dialogue with these other institutions that have already been thinking about the mass nature of atrocity.
So Lauren, we have just barely enough time to get to your question. So you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, my question is hopefully a quick one, Jonathan. It was for Stephen. I just wondered if he could say more about, in the case study sites that they looked at, in what ways did the state seek to respond to this increase in the use of digital forms of mobilization? Like, in what ways did they try to react to that? Thank you.
That's a really interesting question, and it is it depends. It's been periodic. To be very honest, the state has not very successfully responded in both of our cases, and certainly in the case of the Great Lakes, we're still seeing the streams come out on a regular basis, and frankly, Israel makes a number of technical excuses as to why the bandwidth is limited in the West Bank. But there are Palestinian scholars who think that that is part of their response, an attempt to limit bandwidth, which, by the way, is what the Sudanese government tried to do as well in the context of the uprisings in Sudan. But again, they've not been very successful. There are now that I'm in this space doing this research, I'm getting literally daily streams of another digital document showing the violations of rights or another action. So at this point, there have not been very successful. There may have been attempts to limit bandwidth, but that seems not to be succeeding in stopping digital documents from getting out.
So I'm getting a message that I think we're a little bit, the next group apparently has to get set up. So thanks everyone. I guess we're at the end of time or a little bit over time. Thanks for staying, and thanks for all of the questions and comments that were in the chat space. Apologies that we weren't able to get to everyone. And thanks to the speakers today for very excellent presentations and for doing a really stellar job of managing time. I'm very humbled, and great insights, wonderful insights. Once again, we invite everyone who's interested in submitting a manuscript of the thematic issue. Feel free to contact me or Liljeblad or Peter, we're the co-editors. And I left my email contact in the chat space. Well, for me, it's good night, everyone, and we'll see you during the rest of the conference. So thanks. Bye.
Thank you.